Why did OpenAI arrive late to defend the openness that it once abandoned? Nvidia has formed an open model alliance with 5 founding members, including Palantir and IBM, and in another powerful endorsement of open models, OpenAI, the company that all but abandoned its own namesake in favor of proprietary, closed, and for-profit models, has made a very interesting move of its own, signing on to the recent letter backed by Microsoft and Meta supporting open-weight models and cautioning against limiting them. Now here's the claim I'll stand behind. Closed AI still collects the rent for now, but evidence increasingly shows that the durable advantage lies in truly open AI. Come with me, let's get into it. On Monday, Nvidia turned a week-old open letter into a standing institution. It launched the Open Secure AI Alliance with 5 founding members: Palantir, IBM, CrowdStrike, SpaceX, and Hugging Face. The alliance wants governments to recognize open models as defensive assets, not liabilities. And its warning is really blunt. Blanket restrictions, it said, would weaken defensive capacity and risk concentrating power, dependence, and vulnerability in a few closed providers. Now that last phrase gets to the center of this fight. An open-weight model gives you the model's parameters. You can download them, run them on your own machines, inspect them, change them, build on them without asking a provider. A closed model, though, stays behind the company gate. The company controls access, pricing, limits, and often the record of what happens inside of it. We covered this policy fight in depth just a couple of days ago when 5 companies opposed broad U.S. restrictions and all 21 APEC economies endorsed open source cooperation. Today's development changes the structure of that resistance. A letter can fade after a news cycle, but a named alliance has members, an identity, and a reason to return the next time that a government proposes a new limit. Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang carried the same argument in his first ever post on X. He wrote that the world needs both frontier closed models and frontier open models. Satya Nadella, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Sundar Pichai all endorsed the letter. Nadella called open weights essential to a healthy AI ecosystem. Musk wrote, "Jensen is right, this has my full support." Roughly 200 startups organized through the Little Tech Association also urged the government to leave open models unrestricted. Investor Bill Gurley described the split as 2 factions. One wants OpenAI and Anthropic to own everything, he said, followed by then everybody else, including customers. Now that framing is really sharp because it names the commercial divide beneath the security language. Nvidia sells the computing hardware, of course, used by open and closed labs alike. A world with thousands of organizations running their own models creates a much broader market for Nvidia's chips, so you can see why they're really pushing for this. Microsoft can also host open models in its cloud. Meta can spread models that weaken the gates around rival services. Hugging Face sits at the center of open model distribution. So these are not just companies that are being altruistic here. They do get a benefit from it. Palantir, IBM, CrowdStrike, and SpaceX each gain when capable models can be adapted to specific systems without waiting for a Frontier Labs permission, and Frontier increasingly is simply OpenAI and Anthropic. So when this many incumbents converge, that convergence does tell us something about the shared interest. It doesn't certify every claim they make, but still, the underlying argument does deserve to be judged on the evidence. A model's nationality actually tells you very little about whether one deployment is safe. The security question depends on how a model is used, where it runs, what access it receives, and who can inspect its behavior. The U.S. executive branch had been weighing restrictions on open-weight releases, and it framed those limits around national security and fears that Chinese labs could copy American systems. And on July 22nd, Treasury threatened sanctions against Chinese open model firms. That approach treats a whole country as one threat while ignoring what people inside that country are actually building. Recent Chinese work has included an explainable clinical AI system that predicted acute kidney injury across more than 140,000 hospital admissions. And as we'll discuss in a moment, it has produced a new challenger to the 3-company lock on the world's memory chip market. The capability varies, the uses vary, the actors vary. National origin does not collapse those differences into one risk. And the most revealing participant in Monday's shift arrived quite late. OpenAI had been lobbying for tighter restrictions on Chinese open models. It then reversed course and joined the broader industry camp, warning against premature limits. Microsoft and Meta also backed the open weight letter, so OpenAI's signature stands apart because the dispute runs through the company's own history. OpenAI was created to develop genuinely open AI. That mission supplied the name. The company later moved onto a closed commercial footing. Its most capable systems now stay behind its services, and users receive access on OpenAI's terms. Mira Murati left OpenAI over this exact dispute and founded Thinking Machines Labs around truly open-source AI. On July 16th, that lab released its first model, Inkling. Now OpenAI has joined an initiative discouraging governments from restricting the kind of models that it once set out to build. That reversal shows the conflict inside OpenAI never really ended, even if it doesn't actually restore the original mission. One side of the company depends on closed access as a business model. Another still understands that a system dominated by a handful of gated providers leaves everyone else dependent purely on those providers, and probably understands the importance of swaying with the demands of the market as well. And further, dependence on just those few sources brings security risks of its own. If a closed provider withdraws access, or raises the price, or changes its rules, or decides that a research request looks dangerous, then the user has no model to inspect or repair. But open weights travel. Copies survive policy changes and company failures. Researchers can audit them from outside the institution that trained them. Defenders can adapt them to systems that a distant provider has never even seen. Now, those traits also create dual-use risk. Anyone who possesses a model can attempt harmful work with it. The answer then has to involve deployment, access to real systems, and the conduct around the model. A nationality fence or a blanket weight restriction places possession itself under suspicion, and it also exclusively strengthens those few providers allowed to remain inside the fence to the detriment of everybody else. Nvidia's alliance exposes how unstable that arrangement has become. So the company supplying the basic compute is saying that concentration creates vulnerability, and security firms have joined it. Hundreds of startups have joined it. One of the largest closed model companies has crossed over late and added its name to supporting truly open models. Each participant has its own reason, of course, but together they're challenging the core assumption behind closed AI, that concentrating capability will create a durable advantage for the companies controlling the gates. Closed providers still dominate frontier access. They still collect enormous revenue. They still hold models that outsiders cannot inspect. Their grip on the direction of the field, though, looks weaker today. The company named OpenAI has once again found itself defending openness. When it stopped doing so, open-weight AI was far behind. Now the tables have turned, and right on cue, OpenAI moves again, following the market trend. All right, moving to another story here. The Alliance challenges concentration at the model layer, but now move one level down into the chips that keep those models thinking. Changshin Memory Technologies, or CXMT, debuted in Shanghai's Star Market on Monday. Now, the Star Market is Shanghai's tech-focused stock board. CXMT's shares closed their first day up more than 470%. Its valuation reached nearly 3.3 trillion won, or about $487 billion, and that made CXMT the most valuable listed company in mainland China. And the rush happened during a global technology sell-off that has erased roughly $1.5 trillion in recent weeks. So investors aren't simply buying whatever carries a tech label. They are placing an extraordinary premium on a particular part of the AI supply chain. CXMT makes DRAM. DRAM is the fast working memory beside an AI accelerator. The accelerator performs the calculations, but memory keeps the active data close enough for the chip to actually use it. A powerful accelerator starved of memory is like a brilliant cook with every ingredient stored across town. The ability exists, but the work slows while everything travels back and forth. 3 companies have controlled roughly 90% of the DRAM market for years: Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. And that concentration has turned memory into one of the tightest choke points in the AI build-out. SK Hynix has warned that supply shortages could stretch toward 2027. Server lead times have already passed 40 weeks, as we covered recently here on the Century Report. CXMT enters that market as a heavily capitalized fourth challenger. The company is headquartered in Hefei, China. Chairman Zhu Yiming founded it back in 2016. CXMT said that it will use the money from the offering to expand memory chip production and research, and that is the useful part of the valuation. Hundreds of billions in market value can attract workers, finance plants, fund experiments, and absorb manufacturing failures while the company tries to improve. The first-day pop still deserves some skepticism, though. A 470% surge tells us that investors see a strategic opening. It tells us that domestic chip production carries powerful financial and national backing. It doesn't tell us how many advanced chips CXMT can actually produce successfully from each wafer, and its manufacturing yields against Micron remain unproven. Memory prices also run through brutal cycles. A shortage can send prices soaring, followed by a wave of new capacity that sends them crashing. CXMT still has a real production gap to close. So, the valuation is a resource pointed at a problem. It isn't a scorecard of what the company has achieved yet, though. And near-term relief also remains unlikely, even from a fourth company here. A public listing cannot instantly shorten a 40-week server lead time or create a mature manufacturing process. So that direction still stands. A three-company market can hold enormous influence over the price and pace of AI infrastructure. Every model developer eventually meets that physical limit, no matter how elegant its software may be. A fourth producer adds another place to buy, another manufacturing path to improve, and another source of pressure on the incumbents, yes. But whether CXMT becomes a lasting rival will depend on what its factories deliver after the market celebration ends. But a choke point this profitable will keep drawing attempts to break it. The memory layer now has a fourth challenger with enough capital to make a serious run. A wider supply base means no single circle gets to set the price of intelligence forever. All right, shifting away here. A new chip maker is trying to widen the physical supply beneath AI, but our next story widens something else: the ability to measure what an autonomous system can actually do. Anthropic and Andon Labs released Drone-Bench, also called Project Pilot. It follows Project Vend, which tested whether an AI could run a shop, and Project Fetch, which put a model in command of a robot dog. When we covered Project Fetch back in June, Claude Opus 4.7 completed the quadruped tasks roughly 20 times faster than the fastest human team. Drone-Bench moves that evaluation into the air. The task sounds simple: fly a quad rotor through an indoor office, find a specific person, and follow them. For a model that requires several different abilities to work in sequence. First, it has to reconstruct the space around it, and then it has to locate itself inside that map, and then it must navigate through the course, detect the correct person, and continue following that person as both the drone and the target move. Drone-Bench measures those 5 steps separately: reconstruct, localize, navigate, detect, and follow. That breakdown is what makes the test diagnostic. If the drone fails to find someone, then researchers can see whether the model misunderstood the room, or lost track of its own position, or chose a bad route, or failed to recognize the target. A single pass-or-fail score would hide all of that. The researchers tested 15 different models. Claude Fable 5 scored highest overall, but it still failed the reconstruction step. No model completed the full autonomous flight from beginning to end. That keeps the result in proportion here. These models aren't yet flying this course successfully on their own. The failure is also the most useful information in the benchmark produced. Reconstruction now has a documented threshold. Researchers know where the leading system stopped. Model builders can then test whether the next release actually clears the same point, which is what happened with Project Fetch. They got better and better, and suddenly the model was able to do what previously it couldn't. And people writing oversight rules can tie requirements to these real measured abilities as the progression occurs. The researchers used a $129 DJI Tello EDU drone, and that choice may be as important as the model rankings. A university team or an independent researcher or an outside auditor may then be able to reproduce the software-based portions of the test without a robotics lab or a military budget, though model access, of course, and computing still carry the costs. But the measuring instrument, that cheap drone, sits within reach of ordinary researchers. They can check the lab's claims, they can change the course, they can add harder conditions, they can watch how different models fail. That openness is rare in physical AI evaluation. Advanced robotics tests often depend on expensive machines, custom spaces, private software. Only the organization making the claim can afford to reproduce the setup. But here, the basic rig costs less than many phones. And that becomes crucial as capability improves, because locating and following a person has two futures built into the same skill. A drone could search a collapsed building for someone trapped inside, for example, but the same competence could support persistent surveillance. The model maps a space, finds a person, and follows with no technical line separating those two uses. Purpose comes from the people who deploy it, the access they grant, and the rules around the system. The research note names the pressure that may appear after the models improve. Once models pass capability and reliability thresholds, there will be real pressure to treat human oversight as a cost rather than a safeguard. That is unusually clear. A person monitoring the drone adds time and expense. Once the autonomous system works most of the time, a company or agency gains a financial reason to remove that person. The remaining failures then land on whoever happens to be underneath the mistake. Drone-Bench gives oversight something concrete to work with before that pressure peaks. A regulator could require a human handoff when reconstruction confidence falls below a tested level. An operator could document how often the model loses its position. An auditor could compare performance across different rooms, lighting conditions, people, and obstacles. Those rules become possible because each step has been made visible. Now, for years, society often discovered the reach of a new capability after someone deployed it widely and something went wrong. This benchmark reverses that order. The models haven't completed the flight yet, but researchers have already published the course, the equipment, the stages, and the failure. Now, watch where the first full success appears. If the next model clears reconstruction on this public benchmark, then outsiders can test it immediately. If the breakthrough happens behind a closed evaluation, then the public may receive only the lab's description of what occurred. The drone still can't finish the job, but the map for measuring that progress is already in everyone's hands. All right, shifting to the last story for today. Drone-Bench makes a future capability visible before deployment. In Texas, though, communities are trying to make today's infrastructure costs visible before another planning cycle passes. On Thursday, the Texas Water Development Board approved its initial 2027 state water plan, and in that same action, it denied a petition to forecast how much water data centers will draw. The board deferred that work to the 2032 plan. Texas builds its water plan on a 5-year cycle, and so the decision leaves one full planning period without a forecast for one of the state's fastest-growing sources of water demand. Data centers use water for cooling. The exact draw varies, of course, by site and cooling design, which is one reason that good measurement is worth getting right. It's also worth keeping that draw in proportion, though, because a lot of the water alarm doesn't actually survive the comparison. Every data center in the country used about 17 billion gallons of water directly in 2023, according to Berkeley Lab. American farms draw that much for irrigation roughly every 6 hours. And the country's golf courses use more than 20 times as much water as its data centers, and almonds use even more than that. As a share of the nation's water, data centers barely register, honestly, and a lot of the "they're draining our aquifer" argument is really just discomfort with AI that's reaching for the nearest complaint. But what that national number hides is where the pressure is actually real. The draw is intensely local, so one big campus can lean on a single aquifer as hard as several golf courses. And the bigger water cost is indirect, back at the power plant, which is exactly what the San Antonio gas plant fight is about. The gap in the water plan is real, but the oddest worry here is siting and energy. Now, the board's staff cited the late stage of the current planning cycle as their reason for delaying the water planning this time around. Board member Brady Franks acknowledged what the omission could suggest. He said, "I just didn't want folks to think that if it's not in the water plan, someone's not thinking about it or someone's not considering it. So he's being very candid there. People inside the agency are thinking about the issue, according to that statement, but the approved plan still leaves the demand uncounted. Board attorney Breanne Hunter said that the agency is developing methods to separate data center demand from crypto miner demand in the next cycle. That work is worth doing. The two industries can place different pressure on local water systems, and a combined category would blur where the demand actually comes from. But a method delivered in 2032 can't guide the 5 years covered by the 2027 plan. The delay lands as data center developers are also moving outside another public planning system. Long grid interconnection queues have pushed some companies to build private gas plants beside their campuses. Those plants supply the data center directly and let the developer move faster than the shared grid would. On July 21st, the Environmental Integrity Project, the Sierra Club, and the Public Citizen filed a Clean Air Act notice of intent to sue over natural gas-powered off-grid data centers built by Vantage and VoltaGrid in San Antonio, Texas. The groups allege that the gas generation operates outside the permitting process that would normally govern emissions at that scale. Those allegations haven't been tested. The notice is the first required procedural step toward a lawsuit, not a court ruling. Even so, the alleged route around oversight is indeed worth examining. A developer builds its own gas generation to avoid waiting for a grid connection. Environmental groups allege that by obtaining minor source permits for its on-site generation, the project may also move around the more stringent air permitting review that major sources would trigger. The campus receives electricity sooner. The surrounding community receives the pollution. The public process loses the chance to count and examine that cost before construction. Water and air now show the same gap from two different directions. So Texas has approved a 5-year water plan that doesn't forecast data center demand. Developers have built gas plants that the environmental groups say operate outside the normal emissions permits. One cost waits until 2032 to enter the plan. Another may require a lawsuit before it enters the record. Now, the computing can still be built. The test is whether developers count the water, disclose the emissions, obtain the permits, and pay the full price of the infrastructure that they choose. That distinction has become more important as the opposition spreads. Data center moratorium proposals now reach 38 states. Separately, at least 75 projects worth roughly $130 billion were blocked or delayed nationwide for the first quarter of 2026. Some opposition will contain broad objections to the technology itself, but other people just want enforceable terms for the water, the power, the pollution, and the public money that are involved. A community can decline an unpriced resource draw even when the computers behind it do valuable things. And the broader policy direction is already moving toward cost accounting. On July 24th, the House Energy and the Commerce Committee voted 52-0 to advance the Ratepayer Protection Act. That bill would require very large data centers to pay for the grid upgrades that they cause. The Texas Water Petition and the Clean Air Act notice work on the same basic problem through different channels. One asks the planning agency to count demand before approving a long-term plan. The other uses a legal process to challenge emissions that the groups say escaped ordinary review. The usual reading says that regulators can't keep up with the build-out. That describes the speed gap, but it misses how change often happens. The petition forced the Texas agency to confront a missing category. Breanne Hunter says that a separate method for data centers and crypto miners is now under development. The 2032 accounting exists as a promise because petitioners demanded it during this cycle. The Clean Air Act notice uses a lever that remains available when a project has already moved forward. It starts a process that can place emissions, permits, and operating choices into a public record. Deferrals and lawsuits can feel like evidence that governance has failed, but they are also the mechanisms that drag hidden costs onto the ledger. So the outcome now turns on what happens next. Texas can spend the coming years measuring data center water demand and still leave that knowledge outside the binding plan, or it can use the new method to guide permits and local supply decisions before 2032 arrives. Now, Vantage and VoltaGrid can answer the emissions allegations with evidence and permits. The groups can then test those answers through the legal process. Either way, the period when a company could describe an off-grid plant as private infrastructure and leave the wider cost invisible is narrowing. The build-out is forcing water, air, power, and community impact into the same account. That is how infrastructure matures. Its full price stops hiding in somebody else's well, somebody else's lungs, or somebody else's electricity bill. All right, let's close it out for today. Let's return to the company that arrived late. OpenAI joined a defense of open models after lobbying for tighter limits. Its signature stood out because the company still lives inside the split written into its own name. Closed access generates revenue and control. Open weights create systems that people can possess, inspect, and defend. Nvidia has now organized that second force into a standing alliance. Its motives, of course, are commercial, as are the motives of the other incumbents that are joining it. But the deeper movement exceeds their intent. Once model weights travel, the original builder can no longer decide who audits them, who adapts them, or who carries them into the next use. That widening showed up at every layer today. CXMT entered the public market with a valuation near $487 billion. Its factories still have to prove themselves. The enormous capital behind the company shows how a three-firm choke point summons a fourth challenger. Drone-Bench placed an autonomy test on a $129 drone. Every model that was tested failed somewhere. Now, any outside researcher with the rig can now watch that boundary move. And in Texas, people are using petitions and environmental law to force water and emissions into plans that left them out. Now, these are very different kinds of access. One concerns who can hold a model. One concerns who can manufacture memory. One concerns who can verify a capability. And one concerns who can see and challenge the cost of building the infrastructure. They all push against the same old arrangement, though. A small circle holds the system, writes the account, and asks everyone else to simply trust what it says. Now, that arrangement is unfortunately still powerful. Closed model providers still hold much of the frontier. Three firms still supply almost all the DRAM. Anthropic still controls the models tested in its benchmark. Texas still approved the water plan without the forecast. But control is becoming harder to preserve at every layer. The compute maker now defends open weights. Capital is funding another memory producer. A physical benchmark can be reproduced outside the lab. Communities are creating the accounting that the institutions themselves postponed. Closed AI can keep winning contracts and collecting fees, but the more durable win belongs to capability that spreads. Evidence that outsiders can check, and infrastructure whose true cost enters the record. That is the hopeful turn today. Intelligence is moving into more hands. The hardware beneath it is drawing new challengers, the tests around it are becoming cheaper to reproduce, and the people living beside its infrastructure are gaining ways to make the hidden bill visible. Now, the walls do still stand, but they no longer define where the future is going. See you tomorrow.